Introduction to In the Days of These Kings, the Book of Daniel and Preterist Perspective by J. Rogers. I'm going to take a few minutes and go through the table of contents in the first section. Let's pick up with Part 3, Historical Background and Resources. And as I said, this part of the book I thought was going to be a fun little jaunt through history. And as I started to write it, I realized how little that I actually knew about ancient history. One of the things I wanted to do was to show how often Daniel is quoted or alluded to in prophecy. And so I decided to back up as far as Isaiah and deal with Cyrus, who's the Cyrus and the destruction of the city of Babylon is prophesied in Isaiah, and then Daniel gives the actual event as it happened historically, gives the account of it. There's a timeline, and there's a lot of controversies over timeline. I explain why I believe that the timeline is not as difficult as some people make it out to be. The Babylonians actually kept very accurate astronomical records, and so you can line up to the actual day and the hour when certain things happen, like lunar eclipses and so on, and then you can pinpoint the year of certain kings of Babylon and Persia. Jeremiah also has a lot to do with Daniel because he prophesied the 70 years of captivity. Another question people have is about Ezekiel and is Russia Gog and Magog. And I also try to interpret Ezekiel all the way through the end of Ezekiel, where he talks about the temple, what that symbolizes. There's a brief section on Daniel as a historical figure, and then I give a post-exile timeline. And I've had numerous discussions with people who have all kinds of interesting theories, but I basically keep to a very traditional view on what the post-exile timeline was. Haggai and Zechariah gave their prophecies in the time of Darius. Darius the First, the Great, who was one of the Persian kings. And then I believe that the Book of Esther took place after that. The Book of Ezra is interesting because a lot of people don't realize that Ezra was writing later on, but he included the history of Haggai and Zechariah. And then he picks up with his own story, and he describes what happened to him in the first person. Nehemiah was written by Nehemiah. It's more of a sequel to Ezra. And we actually see Ezra mentioned in the book of Nehemiah. Then Malachi, which is the last book in the Old Testament to be written. There's an interesting apocryphal book called the Book of Baruch. And the Book of Baruch, a lot of people don't realize, relies heavily on the Book of Daniel. Daniel is extensively alluded to and quoted in the Book of Baruch. So that's one of the evidences for an early date. Same thing with the Book of Maccabees. Book of Maccabees, again, mentions the Book of Daniel. It alludes to the fulfillment of the prophecy of Daniel in the person of Antiochus Epiphanes in that period. Then we have some Dead Sea Scroll commentaries on Daniel, which are interesting because it shows that from a very early date that Daniel was accepted as scripture, and we have 8 portions of Daniel among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and every single chapter is represented in some form, including Daniel chapter 12, which is in one of the commentaries. Then we have New Testament references and allusions. Daniel is one of the most quoted books in the New Testament. Jesus believed it was scripture. He quotes from Daniel 4 times in the Mount Olivet Discourse. Daniel is also extensively quoted in the Book of Revelation. And I give what my timeline of the Book of Revelation would be. This section right here, the New Testament references and allusions, could be a separate book, but I had to actually cut it short because the comparison between Daniel and Revelation is so rich that there's no way I would be able to contain it all in this book. Also, this section, I could probably write a separate commentary on each one of these books that quote Daniel. I didn't cover the entire books. Like, for instance, I dealt with Zechariah but I didn't exegete the entire book. But there's quite a bit in Zechariah that relates to Daniel. So maybe at a later date, I'll be writing another book in which I use Old Testament prophecy to interpret the book of Revelation. A biblical history prior to Daniel's prophecy was interesting to me because I didn't know how far back I wanted to go. I certainly wanted to mention the Assyrians, and I have a little short, quick and dirty section here on the Assyrians. But then I decided that I really needed to go back all the way to this date right here, 2349 BC. And this includes the post-flood era, which includes the Tower of Babel. Really, Babylon, which is the setting for the book of Daniel, had its origin in the Tower of Babel. Then we have the period of Abraham to King David, which is interesting because what we find is that Abraham and the judges and King David were fighting the seed of the Hamites. And the Hamites were people who occupied Canaan, who came out of the Tower of Babel. They were people who were influenced by what happened during the Tower of Babel. And there's this whole theme throughout Genesis and the different books of the Old Testament up until the prophets that show you this war between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, which is what I believe that Daniel is about and is pointing to. Then we have the different kings of Daniel's first kingdom, which is the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Nebuchadnezzar is mentioned specifically, as well as Belshazzar and Darius the Mede. They're all mentioned in the book of Daniel, but a lot of people don't realize that there are these other characters, and we know that evil Merodach, Neriglissar, are actually mentioned in the Bible, but not in the book of Daniel. But these were other descendants of Nebuchadnezzar that came in this interim period. But there is no prophecies from those periods. So we only get Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, and Darius the Mede. The second kingdom is interesting. This is the whole Persian period. And there's an interesting chiastic structure of Daniel's fifth vision. It begins with Cyrus the Great. There are the four Persian kings of Daniel 11. Cambyses, Smerdis Magus, Darius the son of Hystaspes. We have Xerxes the Great, Artaxerxes his son, and I end up giving a timeline of the Persian king. So this is a period of time that comes after the prophecy of Daniel, and Daniel very accurately predicts all of these kings. Even more interesting is Daniel chapter 11. Daniel chapter 11 deals with the third kingdom and the fourth kingdom. And all of these kings in here are kings who are mentioned very specifically in Daniel. It's amazing because he's writing in the 6th century, and these are 4th and 3rd century kings going all the way down to Antiochus Epiphanes. And there's a line of kings in Daniel 11 that are prophesied to the T. And I say in the book that it covers really interesting events. People like Hannibal, who brought his elephants over the Alps. We've heard of the Rosetta Stone, the invention of geometry by Euclid. This whole period, this Greek period in history, was the time when the third kingdom in Daniel chapter 11 was being fulfilled. And here were the kings that Daniel specifically prophesies. And some of the generals, some of the governors, and so on. And then we get down to the time of Judas Maccabeus, which is the fulcrum of Daniel chapter 11 and Daniel chapter 8. The later Seleucid kings, which is not prophesied in Daniel, and then the later Ptolemaic kings. This brings us all the way down to Daniel chapter 11, 36 through 45, which is probably the one area of Daniel that most commentators disagree on. People pretty much agree that this is how Daniel chapter 11, 1 through 35 went down. There's very little disagreement on this. But then when we get to Daniel's fourth kingdom, as Calvin says, commentators are utterly at sea. They have no idea who is this king who exalts himself. The futurists say it's the Antichrist. Other people say it's the Pope during the time of the Reformation. Other people say it's Antiochus Epiphanes. Other people say it's Herod. I hold the view that it's Julius Caesar. And I explain that in detail why I believe that. I hold to something called the Julienne Thesis. Calvin himself hinted at that. He didn't actually say that Julius was it, but I think I'm one of the first persons to fully develop it. Calvin said that the king who exalts himself is the Roman Empire from Julius Caesar all the way through the time of Nero. But he sees it as beginning in the time of Julius Caesar. So I kind of came up with this on my own, and I was very pleased to find Calvin said something very similar.